there's so much investment in healthcare right now.
What is charge capture?
They now have to understand they have to be involved and they have to be engaged.
Hello and welcome to the RevTech Rx Podcast powered by Avelead. I'm David Kozlowski, and today we're talking all about revenue and KPIs. Alongside me is Jawad Shaikh, CEO of Avelead, Michael Kittoe, a CFO in the healthcare industry, and Greg Forshey, who is the VP of Client Success. The simplest question I have to kind of start this off is, what are the biggest goals in terms of a CFO? What are you trying to accomplish every single day, every year, quarter, you name it?
Well, from my perspective, it's really serving the community that you live in, which is not always an easy task. There's many things that go into that, but that's what I feel that I'm there for every day, is making sure the hospital can meet the needs of the community today and tomorrow.
The key part of that, right, is to put the where the rubber meets the road is making sure that the hospital survives, right? We talk a lot about no margin, no mission. I know that's one of Greg's favorite quotes as well too. So that's the key responsibility, I think, of the CFO and Michael, is to making sure, we're able to take care of the community what we need to, and to be able to support that community and to be able to support that mission, you have to have a margin. And how are you able to do that?
Yeah. Sounds like if a CFO is saying that, I would assume everybody has the same goal and mission, right? To keep the lights on in the hospital, which is therefore, in fact, serving the community. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you were to say that the number one goal is to serve the community, how are you doing that as a CFO?
Well, the saying of cash is king is important, because it's really one of the key metrics that I look at for the organizations I've led as a CFO would be days cash on hand, because that really tells you critically of how well you're able to continue should all your sources of funding cease for whatever reason. And there's risk of that, or change significantly, whether it's regulatory changes that happen with Medicare, Medicaid, those types of things happen. So you really have to have sufficient cash reserves to be able to weather those, and should those events happen, be able to retool to what the new environment's going to bring. And over the last few years, we've had to do a lot of retooling.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask, what is the standard in your mind of this, how much cash on hand you should have in terms of length, timeline?
It really depends a lot on what your spend is. And of course, that's one of the factors that goes into days cash on hand. But, at minimum, a critical level that you look at from a rating agency perspective is about 80 days cash. And, that's kind of the threshold that you'd like to have, because when I talk about retooling, should a significant change happen in your community, your region, whatever, you have to be able to retool, and have an 80 days cash, can buy you some time to retool.
Interesting. And have you found yourself something that's maybe scary? Like, I've only got 30 days cash on hand.
Yes, I have absolutely have. I've had organizations where I've had very comfortable cash levels, and some that were very uncomfortable cash levels. I can share one organization I was in, cash levels went down to 10 days cash on hand. And there were a couple, pay periods where for payroll, I had to tap into a line of credit to make those payrolls. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in. So really building the days cash is a critical factor to allow you to be strategic, because you don't always want to be focused on the current. You want to be building for the future, and having some cash reserves is important for that.
Is your scenario that you're speaking of more common than not? If I walk into a hospital, I assume everyone's rich. Like, this is a ton of money in here. Doctors are making tons of money. Nurses are. Then I hear 30 days, we got to tap into credit. Is that more common, this scenario these days, or is it not? Is that rare?
It's probably more common than one would think, but it's not the norm. So it's it's probably 10 to 15% of hospitals are struggling at those levels on a daily basis.
It sounds to me, right, that all I need to do to be a CFO is just have 90 days of cash or 80 days of cash, right, and be prepared to serve the community, and I'm a CFO. Am I right on this?
Yeah,
or
it's
is
really
there
that simple.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, what is, how do you, what are the things to do to get from the 10 days to 90 days? Like, what can we?
I think Michael addressed or talked on this a little bit. So really a couple key things are looking towards the future, right? You can't be so short-sighted that all you're focused on is, I only have 10 days or I only have 20 days, because then you lose the opportunity that probably exists there. So what I've seen a lot of hospitals do is they do a service line analysis, really saying which of our service lines are the ones that we're losing a lot of money on, or the service lines that we're actually making a decent margin on that'll allow us to increase that day's cash on hand. So, the reality is, once you do that service line analysis, if you say my OB department or my L&D department, we just aren't delivering enough babies to actually cover the expenses associated with staffing that department, you might have to make the difficult decision to say, it's costing us X amount of dollars every month, every week, et cetera, which is hitting on our days cash on hand. We have to close down that department, right? Sure. And so that's a difficult decision that CFOs have to make. But you know what? It's the only way that they're going to get over that hump and actually make any leeway is to say, we have to close that. If someone needs to have a baby, we'll have to send them somewhere else, to a facility somewhere else, which is just something that has to be done to be able to take that analysis and do some initiatives around increasing our days cash on hand by performing that analysis and saying what's making us money and what's costing us a lot of money.
So what would you say some of the tools in a CFO's tool belt would be in this particular situation?
Sure. There's not, one key tool to it. Greg touched on an important one, which is your service line review, that you're really looking to optimize your service lines and go across those. When on the revenue cycle side, there's a lot of opportunity there to look at. Are we capturing all the revenue for the work that's being done? Are we billing for it all? Are we collecting for it? So the revenue cycle is typically ripe with a lot of opportunities to what are your denial rates? Are we working those denials appropriately? So many opportunities within there. Productivity in an organization is really key. You have to have an effective productivity tool in place that, as volumes change, that you're flexing appropriately and adjusting the workforce accordingly. There's many different tools that we have to use to really assure that the cash is in the best position it can be in.
I hear sometimes chatter that's mixed in relation to some of these tools that you're talking about, especially in the revenue cycle area. Do you find that these tools are of massive value? And I give you just kind of an example. I see a lot of marketing out there that's like the 1% to the 2% that we're going to save you. How much of an impact does that have on you?
It can be huge, a 2%, increase in your net revenue is enough to make a big difference, as long as you can keep your expense structure stable. It's about the return on the investment. If you have to make investments, they need to generate cash.
Hypothetically, if a CFO said, yeah, I don't really care about the 1%, what would your thoughts be of that individual?
Well, I think it's circumstantial. It depends on what your situation is. That organization where I was with 10 days cash on hand, that was a huge thing. I could maybe go to sleep at night with that 1%. But if you're another system that is 500 days cash in hand, that they're probably like looking for something more significant than that.
Just to add on to that, right? From a CFO perspective, a lot of it's like, hey, what's the ROI? It's just like, I don't care about that 1% depending on what cost, right? It's like, hey, am I spending 0.5% just to get that 1%? So I think putting it in a perspective is a big deal. And then just to kind of expand it, the way I look at KPI, and I think this is in general for all business, but especially for healthcare CFOs as well too, I kind of like, hey, I want to look at how we did, right? They'll look at their monthly numbers. How was the last month? How was the last quarter? Then I want to look at where are we now, right? Like a lot of the cash at hand or that calls into. And then the last is kind of forecasting where are we going, right? That's to tie it into what Greg was saying. If I know, hey, this is what the market's looking for, this is when I want to turn these services on or off. I think having KPIs, there's so many KPIs, so many metrics that you got to look at. But if you are able to analyze what's working or what's not working, what can you do real time with the data that you have to fix the today, and then what can you forecast and what we can say, hey, based off this forecast, what business decisions I need to make.
If we're forecasting and we forecasted another project or something else or through our service line analysis that we'll actually gain 3% on our bottom line, which one are we going to go after in the next 2 quarters? Are we going to go after 3%
Especially with
or
limited
1%?
resources.
With limited
right?
resources, right? We're not hiring double the staff to pull these off. We have to choose one of the two. I'm going at the 3% by expanding the service line as opposed to the 1% for implementing some other new tool.
Right.
Yeah. And I want to touch on the 3% that you're talking about. Like, where do you guys think the biggest area of opportunities are for the hospital while not being biased? Like, genuinely, like we mentioned, there's revenue cycle. There's a lot of different areas. What would you say are like, this is for sure, if I'm going into a hospital day one and they don't have these processes built or these workflows, here's what I'm attacking first because it's easy money, right? What would you say that would be? Or do you have an idea? He's smiling, so I'm like,
yeah, that's an extremely tough question for me because it really is unique to that organization. I've been a CFO in 4 different institutions, and from a financial health of the institutions, they've each had different problems, and so it's really what is the issue that's causing them to not have financial health right now, and addressing that. Is it their revenue cycle? Is it their expense in healthcare? Being a service industry, typically 60 to 70% of our expenses are labor. So it's really hard for me, David, to really say what's the first thing I would attack. It's an analysis of the complete situation and then prioritizing.
Yeah, I think that's the key part is when we talk about KPIs, you know what your standard KPIs are, right? With DFNB, all these cash on hand, all these things. It's getting that assessment in place and knowing, hey, this is where we are. And then based off of that, figuring out what the priorities need to be. And then this kind of ties back to staffing and shortages. It's like you got to identify your priorities and focus on those. And then once that's done, and that's kind of when we talk about technology, is the biggest, I think, opportunity in healthcare in general is there's a lot of reactive approaches, right? We've got to look at denials, or we got to go back and look at where we lose all of our charges, or we got to go back and there's so many things that we can start doing by changing our processes or even using technology to move those things up in the patient life cycle flow or the revenue cycle flow, right? Because there's opportunities to make sure, hey, did I register this patient properly? Was the insurance verification correct? Did I capture the charges accurately? Were there any missed charges or not? That cash on hand days can increase significantly, right?
Yes.
That 1% turns into 3%. The 3% can turn into 5%. It's not just about the numbers, it's the timing of the numbers or the timing of the cash.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a good point, right? Everything does tend to be retro in healthcare, right? Like, based on the last year, we did a really poor job at XYZ, therefore let's try to do something. Or COVID hit and we have no staff to register patients. Now what do we do, right? And so now let's go and get the fire extinguisher out and try to figure this thing out to keep the hospital afloat. But why have we not been using apps and using our cell phones for patients to get registered at a hospital before COVID? And it's just a very reactive industry that typically it puts you up against the wall, whether it's regulatory like Michael talked about or COVID or something else that puts them in a corner and they have to come out swinging and figure out more intuitive ways or automated ways to do things. So. Yeah.
Right. And the reason they're reactive is because healthcare is hard. Right? We talked about it before.
It is
it's
tough.
not because we don't want to do it or they don't have the time to do it. There's regulatory. There's a lot of compliance things. It's not easy. I mean, these guys, and there are staffing shortages all over the place. So you almost have to force yourself to take time out to kind of do it. And I know that's hard.
Yes.
I have a question that's not necessarily related to all of this, but if you had to pick a department that's the biggest pain consistently.
I can say this from, as I mentioned earlier, that I come from a clinical background. Part of my career, I was director of cardiopulmonary services and cardiology, both when I was leading cardiology on the clinical side and as a CFO, is one of my high watch areas. It really is. And I think there's a lot of factors that lead to that. The diagnostics, the testings, and the treatments are changing so significantly that quite often, even from the CMS side of it, that they can't keep up with codes on some of it. So we're providing these services, and there's no codes that you can even bill for some of it. And so it's really one of those areas that are high. And as I sit here talk about cardiology, because I don't want to pick on any one area, my second would be medical imaging, for the similar reason, because again, the technologies, because that happens to be one of the areas that typically can be a financial benefit if it's managed well and managed tight.
But I thought you were going to say the IT department, because they're always pushing technology down.
Yeah.
And David, that was a hell of a loaded question there. Geez, at least Michael's going to have like all the departments he just called out.
Cardio.
I was curious which one caught the biggest pain for the CFO.
That's clickbait there. I can't let Michael be the only one that gets hate mail here after picking his departments. So the two that I would say that are consistently really, really difficult to manage are the high volume departments. So what we've seen consistent are pharmacy and lab. The reason being that they're so high volume, there's so many transactions, there's so many orders, so many results. I mean, we're talking thousands a day, and it's really, really difficult for all the staff that's involved in collecting a lab specimen. That could be a nursing staff, it could be lab staff, and there's a lot of overlap in those two departments, combined with the number of orders and the thousands of items that happen every single day in those two departments. Very, very difficult to manage, very, very difficult to find any gaps you have, and very, very difficult to walk through that process if you're going to try to do it manually or using Excel.
Yeah. You mentioned manual. How does automation truly affect this bottom line concept or increasing the cash on hand? What does it really play a big part in your ecosystem, especially as a CFO?
Clinicians are working, hard out there, but anytime that their documentation, their actions, Greg mentions pharmacy, we're scanning the medications, we're scanning wristbands, and we're delivering the medication there. Well, that charge better be there by doing that, and instead of somebody have to go back and look at the medical administration record and take the charges off of that. That's the way we used to perform. And, I still see organizations today still doing some of that work. So automation is extremely helpful.
Yeah. And not to put a plug by any means in relation to the services that Avelead provides, but if I'm not mistaken, Greg, you know this gentleman pretty well. To a degree. And I gotta ask, was the transition on your end, was it helpful from a financial level?
Yeah, when we really, from an automated process, one specific area, and this is an organization that has about 150 million of net revenue, and we were able to generate $4 million through automation, and it specifically was related to pharmacy and the absence of drug charges that weren't going through. And we were able to fix that, get that automated, and get that hardwired.
And it's tough, right? We talked about doing this stuff on paper, and we assume when you scan it, the med, that it automatically drops the charge. But if you have 3,000 of those scenarios, how do you find the 100 that didn't?
Right.
Well, you don't, right? I mean, it's the hope and pray method. And so having an automated way to say, out of these 3,000, show me the 100 that didn't. Here's the 100. Go fix those. Let's generate that $4 million that is services that you provided anyway, and it should have been charging appropriately for anyway.
Right.
That's really the key, right?
Yeah.
The biggest goal of a CFO and potentially anybody that works in the hospital is obviously to serve the community. The only way that you can do it, if I remember correctly, the CFO is in charge of making sure that there's cash on hand and how many days that is. We want to get to about that 80-day mark. And your biggest job is to make sure that this stays afloat, right? And how do you do that? There's a whole plethora of options out there, one of which is automation. And in terms of your overall goal, if you're achieving that, you are then serving the community. Fair to say?
Fair.
Cool. Hopefully I didn't butcher that recap of it all. Do you guys have anything else though to mention? And
No, the only thing I would kind of add with or end with, it's a bit of is from a financial or revenue cycle perspective, is it, again, just having the visibility to look at backwards, right, where we are today, and then just the forecasting piece, I think, is kind of key, with the goal in mind of how do we move that stuff up. Because one of the things, and just to plug Avelead, is like we're all about how to make sure that every service that the hospitals provide that is supposed to be billable or chargeable is charged and captured, right? And how do we do that? And how do we pull that up into that patient life cycle or the revenue life cycle as well too? Because I think that's what's going to make the greatest impact and help make the staffing easier, their lives easier, as well as get the revenue that the community needs so that hospital can survive and thrive and fulfill their mission.
I really want to make sure that we tie it back to episode 4 with the staffing shortage, because, this making sure that we're getting those charges and capturing shouldn't be a burden to the clinicians that are trying to focus on the patient. It's putting the proper automation in to make their jobs more efficient, and leveraging that staffing that you have there.
yeah.
Yeah, and the only thing that I'll close with is Michael, you asked him the question of name the one thing that you would go after, which is impossible, right? There's a million, and it really is dependent on what hospital. So I think what's kind of key is checking the box and eliminating. If we have a list of 100 things that could be the thing that we need to fix at a hospital, let's check one off. And so now we're at 99. Let's check another one off, right? So whether it's automating a charge reconciliation process or patient access registration issue, check one off the list, and you get down to this narrow focus to say, all right, now we have 5 things left to do out of the 100 that we could have needed to fix when we originally got here. So
Yeah. That's great. Well, I appreciate you guys being on here and going over this with us today. Thanks so much for listening. Again, I'm David Kozlowski with the RevTech Rx Podcast, powered by Avelead. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Take care.